So, I'm sure you've probably heard of the ongoing manhunt for Grant Hardin, the escaped murderer and former cop here in Northwest Arkansas, because this is all going down really close to me, practically in my backyard. So, I want to do a deep dive into this case and get into some things I think the media and law enforcement might be missing. So, let's get into it. Hi, and welcome to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Delaney, and I'm a true crime writer who cusses too much. And I don't normally film in my truck, but I can't really film in my office today for a variety of reasons. And I really wanted to get this video out as soon as possible. Anyway, if you like taking deep dives into interesting cases, you're in the right place. And if you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more like this. So about Grant Hardin. He's a Northwest Arkansas native. He grew up in the Pea Ridge area and even attended the U of A for a couple years before dropping out. And at the time I'm filming this, he's still at large, 5 days after escaping the prison in Calico Rock, Arkansas. The media has rightfully been talking about his background as a police officer, but I'm not sure they're expressing just how long he's been a cop in some form or fashion. Over 3 decades. And how much of a violent, unstable piece of shit he's been in every single job. It looks like he got his start right here in my Favoriteville. Local news stations reported that in August of 1990, he was hired on at the Fayetteville PD, but he didn't even make it through field training before he was let go in May the following year. In his termination letter, the former police chief said that Hardin's efforts fell short of the average officer, and his tendency to not accept constructive criticism, along with indecisiveness under stressful situations, led to this decision. One thing that stood out to the officer was the fact that Hardin apparently could not handle any type of stressful situation, getting, quote, intimidated even under mild stress. So from there, he went on to the Huntsville PD. Huntsville is a little town a couple of counties over from here in the infamously corrupt, at the time, Madison County, locally known as Booger County. Apparently, he only worked there less than a year before he left due to personal reasons.
Suspicious.
Then, in April of 1993, he was hired on as a patrol officer in the Eureka Springs PD. Eureka Springs is only about an hour's drive from Fayetteville. It's the go-to day trip for all of Northwest Arkansas. I was literally just there with my family for Mother's Day. I lived in Eureka Springs in 2000, and I have friends who live there now. If you're interested in learning more about Eureka Springs and its dark history, check out my video on Dr. Baker and the Crescent Hotel. Anyway, about 3 years after Hardin was hired, Eureka got a new chief of police, Earl Hyatt. And apparently, Hyatt immediately clocked Hardin as a bad cop. Hyatt said he was volatile, abusive, and bad-tempered. It only took 6 weeks to find 3 major violations, including the use of excessive force during arrests and, quote, making poor decisions on the job. The last straw apparently was in October 96, when Hardin was caught lying on a police report. And instead of being charged with a crime, which lying on a police report actually is, he was called into Hyatt's office to be fired. But Hyatt said that Hardin chose to resign before the official termination could happen. His next job was apparently with the Rogers PD. Rogers is just a half hour up the road from me, one of the 4 main cities that make up the Northwest Arkansas metro region: Fayetteville, Springdale, Rogers, and Bentonville. My folks live on the outskirts of Rogers. In November of 1997, Amy Harrison was a 3rd grade teacher who was married to another cop in the Rogers PD. She had come into the school on a Sunday to grade papers and do lesson planning. There was a church group that apparently used the school cafeteria as a chapel, and they were holding their worship services on a Sunday morning. At one point, she left her classroom to literally just go across the hall and use the bathroom in the teacher's lounge. When she was finished, when she opened the bathroom door, there was a man standing there with a gun to her face. The man was in stocking feet and had like a ski mask over the top half of his face, just over his nose and eyes, but not his mouth and chin. The man sexually assaulted her at gunpoint right there in the elementary school. So the Rogers PD got on the case. I mean, obviously, she was a cop's wife, so I'm sure there was much greater urgency than usual. Her attacker had been pretty careful not to leave behind any evidence, except for one drop of semen that had accidentally dripped out onto her leg. They ran that DNA through CODIS, but it didn't match anybody in the system. So until they could get a suspect to compare against it, there was just nothing else to go on. And so eventually the case went cold. I couldn't find when exactly or for what reason he left the Rogers PD. I mean, it wouldn't be a surprise if it was for the same kinds of behaviors that he'd been displaying so far. Anyway, he moved on sometime between then and 2008 when he was elected constable for Benton County Township 1. Now, I had never heard of Township 1 before this, but apparently it's like a legal jurisdiction that encompasses parts of Rogers, Avoca, Gateway, and a few other tiny little towns up there. He was reelected in 2012, and after that term was up, in January of 2016, he was hired as the chief of police and only cop for Gateway, Arkansas. Gateway is a teeny tiny little town, population 436. It sits right on the border with Missouri. It's called the Gateway to Missouri, or maybe it's the Gateway to Arkansas, depending on which side of the state line you're on. So a lot of this information I got from the documentary The Devil in the Ozarks that came out in 2023. It's still on HBO Max. Anyway, in it, the people who lived in Gateway and worked with him and around him at that time all said that he was acting like the typical power-mad cop. They said he had a hair-trigger temper and held grudges. He acted like he ran the place because he was the chief of police. He would run people off the road, chase them down, and even randomly pull a gun on people. They called him an angry, evil man, and they were right. But there was one person who stood up to him, James Appleton. Appleton also worked for the city for the water department. His brother-in-law, the mayor, got him the job. So in the course of his tearing around town, harassing the good citizens of Gateway, Hardin ran his patrol car off the road and over a big stump. That apparently tore up the whole undercarriage of the car. And of course, he wasn't going to take responsibility for it, so he demanded that the city, meaning their mechanic, James Appleton, fix it. Appleton told Hardin he wasn't going to fix what Hardin had torn up due to foolishness. So Hardin confronted him in the city parking lot, bowed up to him, basically told him, fuck you, I'm the chief of police, you don't cross me. But Appleton wasn't having it. He didn't back down and continued to refuse to fix the car. Apparently, Hardin was livid at being told no. He continued to harass and threaten Appleton along with the rest of the town. So only 4 months into the job, the city council recommended that he be let go. Once again, he was given the choice to resign or be fired, so he chose to resign. He was able to get yet another job in law enforcement by the end of the year, as a corrections officer at the Northwest Arkansas Community Correction Center, which was a women's prison here in downtown Fayetteville. At the same time, he enrolled in some classes at Missouri Southern State University, studying criminal justice and law enforcement, like he was planning on continuing his career in policing. So that brings us to the crime that brought him down. On February 23, 2017, a fellow named John Bray was driving home from a job when he saw Appleton's work truck pulled over on the side of the road. There was also a white Chevy Malibu parked a little bit behind Appleton's truck. The driver of the Malibu waved Bray on past. Bray could clearly see the driver of the car and saw Appleton on his cell phone inside his truck. After Bray had crested the hill, he heard a bang, which he said sounded like a rifle blast. Moments later, he saw the Malibu speed past him. So Bray turned his truck around to go check on his friend. When he came up to the truck, he saw Appleton was slumped over in the driver's seat, dead from a shotgun wound to the head. Fortunately for law enforcement, Gateway is a very small town, so Bray knew exactly who owned the Chevy Malibu, Grant Hardin. So Grant was pretty much immediately arrested and later pled guilty to the murder of James Appleton. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. When he was being booked, he, of course, had to submit a DNA sample, which was uploaded to CODIS. About a year later, it came back as a match for Amy Harrison's rape back in 1997. He pled guilty to 2 counts of rape, which each had a sentence of 25 years, for a total of 50 years, added on to the previous 30 he was serving for murder. At that point, he was 50 years old. Even if the sentences were set to run concurrently, that's still 50 years. So everyone figured he's just going to die in jail, right? Obviously, that was not the case. Because last Sunday, May 25th, he was somehow able to literally walk right out the front door of the prison, dressed in what cops claim was a homemade law enforcement style costume. As of the time I'm filming this, he's been at large for 5 days. Multiple law enforcement agencies from local police, state police from both states, and even the FBI are on the case. They've got roadblocks, search teams on foot and horseback, and even drones looking for him. Literally, as I was writing this, search choppers were buzzing over my neighborhood. The FBI is offering a $10,000 reward for info leading to his capture. Just go to tips.fbi.gov if you have any leads. Okay, so now you're all caught up on the details of the case. And I have some thoughts. First, media outlets have been reporting on the fact that he had this long history of working in law enforcement, but I don't see any of them really digging into the underlying issue, and that's why I wanted to talk about it here. So I just have to say, this is the kind of thing we've seen in other serial killer cop cases. Now, I'm not saying he's a serial killer, but I wouldn't be surprised. It's certainly within the realm of possibility. Anyway, these bad cops get passed around from law enforcement agency to law enforcement agency because nobody wants to put something bad on a fellow cop's record. Nobody wants to break that blue wall of silence. It's a brotherhood, right? So you can have someone do really, really terrible things as a cop in one jurisdiction, and if it gets so bad he's finally got to be let go, they'll usually give him the chance to either resign or be fired. And if he resigns, then it's just like, oh, well, he just chose to quit. No big deal. And then there's nothing on his record for when he applies to the next agency, which is also why I strongly suspect that James Appleton and Amy Harrison were not his only victims. He was clearly violent, and the way he was able to get away with the rape in 1997 tells me he had to have done something like this, either sexual assault or murder, before. Maybe they just weren't reported. Maybe the victims were afraid because he was a cop, or maybe he killed them and no one ever solved it. That's just my speculation, of course, but I would be surprised if he hadn't. So, at the time I'm filming this, like I said, he's been at large for 5 days, and it's a huge story. They're covering it on all the major news networks and even international ones. And of course, I have a theory about where he might be hiding. Now, I'm no expert. I'm just a broad with a YouTube channel and some strong opinions. But I do have some thoughts. Let me take you through it. 1. He had to have had help on the inside. How else did he get his hands on that costume? Or if it is actually homemade, how did he get his hands on the materials? And how did he manage to sew it without anyone knowing? And if, like police say, that costume was only a crude imitation of a uniform, how did it work on the staff? One staff member actually opened a gate and let him walk through it. 2. I also think he has help on the outside. So that whole area is really remote, heavily forested, and one of the most cave-dense areas in the region. Not to mention all the various abandoned hunting cabins and barns. So yes, there are a lot of places to hide. And while some folks have described him as a survivor, and that he knows all the caves in the region, you can't eat bat poop. Well, I mean, you can, but it probably wouldn't work out too well. When he walked out of the prison, he had nothing but the clothes he was wearing. And for the first 3 days of the search, it was raining almost constantly. Unless you are a hardcore survivalist with a deep knowledge of the area and the appropriate tools, you're going to have to venture out to find food. And somehow, I don't think this asshole knows which wild plants you can and can't eat. I think somebody picked him up after he escaped, and I'm willing to bet that that person or people are still hiding him. 3. So who would do that? Probably not his family. They're, of course, the first people law enforcement look at. Maybe it's just a couple people that he's paid off somehow. But I think it's more likely to be a network of people, a group. So what group would be willing to break the law to help a violent, dirty cop who has ins with lots of law enforcement and correctional institutions around the area, who has access to extremely remote, heavily guarded properties in the woods all around that area? One answer: white supremacists. So I call Fayetteville my hometown because I've lived here more than anywhere else. But I've also lived in some of the other cities and small towns here in Northwest Arkansas. I love my little Fayetteville bubble. However, the rest of Arkansas is not like Fayetteville. And in fact, all of the northern part of Arkansas, including all up and around Gateway, is lousy with white supremacists and far-right militia dipshits. You know, the type that's all about anti-government, fuck the police, until a cop gets caught brutalizing a black person. Then, for some reason, they're all back to blue. Now, I don't know if Hardin had any connection with racist groups, but it wouldn't be a shock if he was at least ideologically aligned with them. He's a violent pig who blames everyone else for the consequences of his own shitty actions, so they've got a lot in common. Maybe the cops are already thinking of this, and they're already looking at that angle, and they just don't want to say anything to the media. That would be smart of them. I hope that's the case. But I also know, and I gotta call it like I see it, in certain parts of the country, like this part of the country, people in law enforcement and the judiciary and pretty much all of the legal and governmental systems just kind of have a blind spot when it comes to these terrorists. And I use that word terrorist very consciously. These are people who spend all their time hoarding ammo and MREs, building bombs, and engaging in target practice for the inevitable race war / societal collapse, aka when the shit hits the fan. And these people are just itching for the chance to kill their enemies. And sometimes some of them do, going all the way back to Oklahoma City and all the arsonists and bombings at abortion clinics. Shameless plug, I go into the history of these violent hate groups in Arkansas and how they eventually became the mainstream of the GOP in my book, The Dumond Affair. Buy it wherever you buy books online. I'll put a link in the description too. Anyway, these types are often treated with kid gloves. Like, they've got to really fuck up in a really major way to get the FBI involved to start investigating them. Because 9 times out of 10, local law enforcement just gives them a pass. Either because they're ideologically simpatico, or it's kind of a good old boy thing. Oh, that's just Billy Joe Jim Bob. Him and his boys, they just like to get up there and shoot guns, and, they're patriots. And just in case you weren't horrified enough by what's going on in the federal government now, the Trump regime has slashed the FBI's domestic counterterrorism programs and pardoned all the January 6th insurrectionists, including those known to be members of violent terrorist groups like the Proud Boys, Three Percenters, and Oath Keepers. But at least the price of eggs is cheaper, am I right? So yeah, that's my 2 cents. Maybe I'm wrong. We'll see. Let me know in the comments if you have a theory about this case. Unless you're here to defend Trump or the January 6thers. In that case, you can just fuck smooth off. Ain't nobody got time for that. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you want to show a little support, you can join channel membership. It's cheap as hell, just like me. Till next time.